It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At CareFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from CareFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
From writer-director Ryan Johnson.
The Holy Grail. A perfectly impossible crime.
Wake Up Dead Man has critics singing its praises.
God help me. Anything else?
It's a deliciously entertaining mystery.
That's nice.
It's certified fresh.
It's a miracle.
Okay, you're freaking me out now.
It's the best Knives Out movie yet.
This case is solvable, right?
Oh, you'll see. It's fun.
Wake Up Dead Man, a Knives Out mystery starring Daniel Craig. Now playing in select theaters on Netflix December 12th, rated PG-13.
George W. Bush, to an extent, not being a particularly well-read historian, he understood what he meant by crusade. Many other people would have understood what he meant by crusade, a worthy expedition, probably with a slight military element, but not realizing quite how that played very firmly into Osama bin Laden's narrative of this being a clash of civilizations and trying to recreate the Caliphate, which, of course, was one of the great objectives of both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State.
Hello. On the 11th of September 1683, at the great city of Vienna, the armies of the Ottoman Empire were preparing to storm the city. But their scouts to the west noticed a vast cavalry force approaching. The next day, Christian horsemen, Poles, Lithuanians, Germans of the Holy Roman Empire, and Cossacks swept down upon the troops of the Caliph and swept them away in one of the most stunning military victories of all time. But what lay at the heart of this clash between Christendom and the Caliphate? West versus East, Christianity versus Islam. Joining to discuss is historian of the Middle East Simon Mayall. We talk about the past's influence on today's fanatics, the conquests of Spain and the Levant by the Moors and the Crusaders, and much, much more. Plenty more history on the way on the pod, including special forces in Italy during the war, a double feature on the anniversary of Trafalgar with episodes on Nelson featuring a very special guest and the battle itself, and much, much more. But in the meantime, I'll hand you over to me talking with Simon Mayall on Christendom versus the Caliphate. Simon, welcome to the podcast. An absolute pleasure to have you on. Here to talk about the House of War, the struggle between Christendom and the Caliphate. But welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Very, very nice to be on Aspects of History. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. Before we were, and for the benefit of listeners here, before we started recording, I had to hold my hands up and admit that this is not so this is wide spread of history, this book, really covering from the whole medieval period, really, all the way into the First World War. So, but we're really talking about key moments in this sort of I thought it would be great to start with really defining terms for the sake of myself. I'm sure the listeners already know, they know a lot more than I do, but for my own sake, the term Christendom, which to me seems a rather medieval term, and then there's the Caliphate. So I wondered if you would be able to help, because these are our two sort of protagonists in your book. So I wondered if I could start by really defining what those are for us listening.
Yes, the Caliphate was very much on the Islamic side an organizing principle of the Muslim world. While in the West, we'll come back to that, nation states were beginning to form until the collapse of the Caliphate after the First World War, basically with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. Although it moved around, there was always an assumption that there was a successor to the Prophet Muhammad, who had died in 632. And there were originally the Rashideen, who were very much the righteous successors. Caliph means righteous successor. The Rashideen, the first four, and the great split in Islam took place during that time between Sunni and Shia. It then moved to the Umayyads, largely an internal Arab civil war. It then moved to people called the Abbasids, if you're looking at big dynasties. Eventually, the Abbasids, to an extent, were really destroyed by the Mongols. So the caliphs, although the idea of Sultan Caliph is split a bit, the caliphs as the legitimate spiritual leader of the Islamic world, all Muslims, became what they call the shadow caliphs in Cairo. And eventually the Ottomans destroyed the Mamluks in 1517. And as part of that, in many ways, the Ottomans just inherited the Caliphate. And it was really Selim the Grim and then his son Suleiman the Magnificent, which really sort of consolidated that the Ottomans would be both Sultan and Caliph. And the Caliphate, really existed, as I say, from the death of Muhammad, really till the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. And Ataturk abolished both the Sultanate and the Caliphate. Christendom was a slightly more amorphous. It was understood as, I suppose, dominions where Christianity and the practice and governance of it was the duty of rulers. But from an early stage, because of the split of the Roman Empire, Christendom always had sort of two parts. It had the Orthodox and the Catholic. And there was, to an extent, a bit of a punch-up between who had precedence. The East still had military dominance. The West had rather fractured with the barbarians, but there was a pope in Rome. The successor, different from the successor of the Prophet Muhammad. But clearly the senior disciple, Peter, who was going to set, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. Whereas in the Muslim world, there was a sort of, at times with the right people, a Sultan Caliph. In the Christian world, there was obviously a pope and periodically an emperor. And so this interesting thing, both of them had a secular approach to the world, which was very much at a time when religion was hugely important to people collectively and individually. And they had a temporal side, which was the arm. And of course, with these two great ideological power blocks in competition, the temporal did often very much dominate because war was a leitmotif and it was underpinned the structure. That was the culture of the time. And Christendom, to an extent, was very, very badly split with the rise of Protestantism. So, within the Caliphate, you find actually the Muslim world split between Sunni and Shia, big division between Arab, Iranian, Egyptian, Turk, might be familiar if you're thinking modern politics. And of course, within Christianity, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant. And then within that, the long, long struggle between England and France, the fight between the Valois and the Habsburgs. So one could talk about Christendom and the Caliphate, and they both have real relevance, but they're equally, as well as in opposition to each other, contain very, very strong divisions, many of which continue to, dare I say, trouble the contemporary world, even though they look rather historical.
Indeed. It's almost, when you talk through the both there, it's like a mirror. They both have tensions within the sort of overall religion. But I wondered how much of the tension between the Christendom and the Caliphate is driven by hunger for land and power, and how much ideological, as in, from a religious standpoint? Both sides will view each other as sort of heretics or the equivalent in the Muslim world.
Well, a lot depended on, I suppose, the time and personalities as well, Oliver. I think it's quite difficult in the modern world, certainly in the West, liberal, secular West, to understand, religion, let alone being religious. And there was always an element of inter-religious conflict, but quite often it was not so much religions against each other, but religions in which the contenders were people of religion. And it's difficult to understand those individual motivations. Issues of heaven and hell and salvation and damnation and the infidel, the heretic, the apostate were really, really important. People felt strongly enough, dare I say, to go to the stake or burn other people from their own religion at the stake. They were quite prepared to massacre people. The Sunni Turks would massacre the Shias with gay abandon. The 30 Years' War saw the depopulation. That was between Christians. Now, Thucydides talked about wars normally being driven by fear, honor, and interest. Collective and individual on both sides. But he was talking in a time of sort of polytheism. When you bring in monotheistic religions, the Romans didn't really fight for a pagan religion. The Persians, Zoroastrianism, not quite the same as the monotheism of Islam and Christianity. And what you then find, I sort of put it down as God, glory, and gold. So there is very strong religious element that you cannot remove, either individually or collectively. There is an issue of glory. That's what drove the leaders of society, were largely from the martial classes. And so, of course, the Pope and the Caliph would harness, this religious fervor with martial ardor. And then there is gold. So gold, glory, and gold. There was a genuine requirement. You could only be a knight if you could afford armor. To get that armor, you needed to have land. The same in the Ottoman world. You needed to be a Ghazi warrior because that gave you slaves, it gave you money, it gave you status, it gave you land, and with its sort of obligations. That was the basis of feudalism. We give you the capacity to have a horse and armor and bring other knights, and in return, your obligation is to come to war with me. But in many cases, you come to war with me willingly because that's the basis of your status in society. So it's a very interesting cultural coming together of religion and the way society was organized, and some of it based, but some of them very long-standing human passions and ambitions.
Well, you mentioned God, glory, and gold, and in the clash of the two civilizations, I guess the Crusades is naturally what one thinks of. And I wondered, how much has the Crusades, the impact of the Crusades, the legacy of the Crusades, driven further clashes between the two? Or is the Crusades not really the right place to start and should go back further, as your book does?
I mean, you can go back further, of course, because interestingly, it was only about 5 years. It was 5 years after the death of Muhammad that the Islamic armies took Jerusalem from the Christians. Obviously, Jerusalem is hugely iconic for Judaism. It's hugely iconic for Christianity. Even though Christianity was a sort of persecuted sect for the first 300 years until Constantine largely begins to adopt it as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And then for 300 years, the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire really adopt Jerusalem as this really, again, iconic city. But in 637, the Muslims take it. And of course, in Muslim theology, Islamic theology, Muhammad had flown there on the winged steed Burak, and then been taken up to heaven by Gabriel and then back down, left a footprint. So suddenly from that time, Jerusalem now becomes really important for Islam. Now, for many, many years, until quite recently, the Jewish interest in Jerusalem is really not of any particular historical significance. It's obviously very important to Jews. But the clashes between Christians and Muslims. So there's a feeling for a long time that the Muslims have taken Jerusalem And they've expanded hugely. I mean, they've destroyed the Persian Empire. This is all 7th and 8th century. Destroyed the Persian Empire, rocked the Byzantines back, taken the Levant and the Holy Lands, taken all of North Africa, completely, overrun Iberia and gone on as far as Tours. So to an extent, you then have about 400 years in which Christianity is very firmly on the back foot. And although the Crusades get a bad name sometimes among people who sort of, multiculturalism and modern attitudes to this, in some ways it was very much a counter-offensive. But at the core of it was, let's capture this religious fervor, this martial ardor, and some of these very, as I say, glory and gold aspects, and let's go and take Jerusalem. And of course, they do take Jerusalem in 1099. But one of the main reasons they take it, of course, is the Islamic world at that stage is so fractured. And they come in at that time of history where if you fed it into the computer nowadays, 9 times out of 10, it would say it just dribbles out in Anatolia or around Antioch. But it doesn't. It takes Jerusalem and it becomes really iconic. Now, in many ways, Jerusalem's only held for 100 years. Saladin takes it back after Hattin, and Third Crusade, Fourth Crusade, all of these, none of them get it back. And at the end, at Acre, the Crusader kingdom goes. And in many ways, that is thumbs up to the Islamic world, to the Caliphate. By this stage, the Mamluks, they've destroyed this Christian enclave. Interestingly, of course, the modern issue is how much certain people in the Muslim world view the state of Israel as a modern manifestation of Western encroachment back into the Middle East. And if you look at the borders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the borders of, obviously, the state of Israel, you might include the Christian communities in Lebanon. There's an overlap. And, the book opens, of course, with Osama bin Laden using these historical reference points that he knows strike a chord. And that's why it is Zionists and Crusaders are in the land of the Prophet, in the land of the holy cities, etc. So although in many ways it's a fascinating point of view, the Crusaders, the crusading kingdom, it does mark quite a strong dividing line. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099 is often used to demonstrate that Christians and Muslims are going to be in perpetual confrontation. And that comes back. But the reality is it doesn't last that long in historical terms. And many fundamentalists say, well, it took us 200 years to get rid of the Crusaders. And the state of Israel has only been here for 80 years, notwithstanding the historical links of Judaism with that part of the Middle East. We will also, in due course, get rid of that. So the modern resonances, although they weren't terribly strong after the expulsion of the Crusaders, continued. For a while, what was left of the Crusader kingdoms were destroyed. But of course, Cyprus and Crete remained under the Venetians. The Lusignans were there. And of course, our great sort of medieval heroes, the Knights of St. John of the Hospital, hung on in Rhodes until the beginning of Suleiman the Magnificent's reign. That was nearly 250 years later.
It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At CareFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from CareFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
That's so interesting. I hadn't quite appreciated that I think you may use the word extremists view Israel as a kind of continuation of the Crusades. Certainly, if you look at the sort of footprint on the
Yeah, it's probably not even extremists. You know, this is quite a well-worn trope. I mean, Joshua Priver wrote a book about the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and he did even then liken it and said in people's mind it does look like another attempt by the West to colonize, you know, areas that, you know, to the Muslims are, you know, historically, religiously theirs. It is the land of peace, the Dar al-Islam, as opposed to, of course, the Dar al-Harb, the House of War, the title of the book.
I see.
So these historical reference points are important to know, because when you hear them, you've got to be in a position to say, yes, I understand where you're coming from, and at least either challenge them or push back or demonstrate you understand the resonance still, the modern resonance.
In the modern day, I mean, you mentioned Osama bin Laden, and George W. Bush rather unwisely used the word crusades, which I suppose would give succor to those who view any kind of involvement in the Middle East as a simple continuation of the Crusades from 1,000 years ago.
Yes, it was. I mean, it really was. I think I was in contact with a good American friend of mine, and we were talking about this book being what I call applied history, that, you know, you read it for interest, you read it for education, and without being, you know, heavy-handed about it, you go, oh gosh, I can see why that would be, you know, and it opens, as you know, Oliver, in the introduction, with Osama bin Laden using George, but I mean, he had talked about Zionists and Crusaders back in the 1990s, after his rejection by the king of Saudi Arabia to use mujahideen from the Afghan war against the Soviet Union to defend Saudi Arabia, home of the two holy cities, against Saddam Hussein, who was looked on as a heretic and a secularist and a compromiser. And of course, the king of Saudi Arabia said, "I'll take basically Christian troops to defend." And there were pictures of, you know, padres, you know, giving communion to Christians in the land of the holy cities. Because a lot of people just didn't make these reference points, but Osama bin Laden did. And of course, when he launched 9/11, he then, you know, justified it. He justified it by the whole reference to Crusaders and whatever.
And the date of 9/11 coincides with the attack on Vienna, doesn't it?
Funnily enough, it does. Vienna is actually released. It's the 13th of September, 1683, is when it's finally Vienna. It's very. You're right. It's right on the cusp of the same date. And you're right. George W. Bush uses the word crusade, and a lot of people say, "Ooh, gosh, I get it." You know, we all nowadays, of course, in Western world, crusade is a noble and worthy objective, a crusade against drinking, drugs, you know, bad driving. But and of course, Eisenhower used it in his book, Crusade in Europe, which was absolutely nothing to do with you know, Islam at all. But it was very much against the idea this was a worthy enterprise underpinned by Christian values against people, you might say the Germans at the time, who'd gone way off the reservation in terms of how they had conducted themselves by, you know, inverted commas, Christian values. So it was out there. So George W. Bush, to an extent, not being a particularly well-read historian, you know, he understood what he meant by crusade. Many other people would have understood what he meant by crusade, a worthy expedition, probably with a slight military element, but not realizing quite how that played very firmly into Osama bin Laden's narrative of this being a clash of civilizations. This was trying to recreate the Caliphate, which of course was one of the great objectives of both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State.
But if you're a moderate in the Middle East, how insulted are you going to be by, a mistaken use of a word or an unwise use of the word? Or indeed, I note in the recent World Cup in Qatar, you had, for England games, as is tradition amongst some fans, to put on the old, you know, fake chainmail and the white cloak with the red cross.
St. George, yeah.
Exactly.
Which was the Templar motif, and the Templars were looked on as very much, very much, the absolute stock troops. They were like the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire. They were the most disciplined, the most, I wouldn't say bloodthirsty, wrong word, but just militarily effective. But that was their circuit, of course. It was the cross of St. George. So it has resonance. as does the cross. And again, it's, you just need a little bit of empathy here, and words carry meanings, and there are most of the or much of the educated world in the Middle East, Muslim, understand the world has moved on, but there are a lot of people, because of the nature of Middle East societies, there are an awful lot of young men without employment. You can't get employment. You don't have a job. You don't have money. You can't set up your own house. There's a chance you won't be able to marry, have children, have dignity that goes with all that. Very important to anybody. And so, there's a lot of people who are susceptible to being given a sense of purpose in life through, a narrative that talks about, going back to the days when this huge expansion in the Islamic world, almost from the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Within 100 years, they were knocking on the door of Tours, and only defeated by Charles Martel. And how could the only reason you could have that extraordinary expansion and military victory would have been if you're spiritually pure and God has given you that. And there's this, every religion goes through it: renewal and decline, renewal and decline. Osama bin Laden's story, or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was the person who did declare himself Caliph in 2014, are preying on that, because it gives people a narrative, and we all know it's why young men join gangs, because they're looking for role models and purpose. And if you can turn it into something that has a religious significance, and use it with what I call selective historical entitlement, selective historical inspiration, and selective historical grievance, you can build up a very powerful a very powerful narrative that's very attractive to some people. And you're only going to look at the number of people who were prepared to do ghastly things supporting ISIS. Absolutely shocking stuff. Particularly with regard to the Yazidis.
So ISIS, that often gets sort of dismissed. Not dismissed. That's the wrong word. But it's described as medieval. And is there a truth to that? In that, in both Christendom and in the Caliphate during the medieval period, some of the practices carried out by ISIS would have been carried out by troops on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, there are shocking instances, Oliver, and we talked a bit about the circumstances of the Crusader capture of Jerusalem, and it in 1099, and it contrasted very much with the recapture of Jerusalem by Saladin in 1087, after the destruction of the Crusader army at Hattin, where actually Saladin was extremely gracious to most of the lay nobility, but absolutely personally killed Reginald de Chatillon, viewed as a very an absolute. He's one of the pantheon of demons in Muslim religion. And in the book I mentioned, and you may have seen it, that in 2010 a parcel bomb was sent to a Reginald de Chatillon in New York by somebody with a keen sense of history. Then when Richard I Lionheart takes Acre in 1191, of course he marches his Muslim prisoners out onto the plain, about 3,000 of them, and in front of Saladin's army just executes them. Now some of that was military raison d'etat. You just had to do it. You couldn't look after them. It was fifth column. And part of it was, even in those days, that sort of thing was bloody hell. That's a bit whatever. And then sometimes it is, as I say, the massacre of the Shia by Selim the Grim, the 30 Years' War, even within religions, let alone between religions. It was a time when, life could be taken for a number of reasons. And yet in among it, you do find extraordinary acts of chivalry. That was how knights viewed each other, but sometimes it wasn't extended to people from other religions. But extraordinary, even in his own time, Saladin was absolutely reported back as this extraordinary. He was just compared to being a chivalric medieval knight. When Richard the Lionheart again was lying ill in Jaffa, waiting to march on Jerusalem, he's sort of he's sent a new horse by Saladin. He's sent peaches. His own physician comes down to see Richard, and then Richard, of course, thinks that he might marry his sister Joanna, previously married to the king of Sicily, off to Saladin's brother Safeddin, the sword of the knowledge, the religion. So there's some very interesting ways that people, certainly the top level of society, viewed each other through, again, this chivalric idea of knightly virtue, which is quite interesting in among, a lot of bloodshed and an awful lot of carnage at certain set points. And the book, of course, looks to try and set in context, because there were long periods when there was not much happening between them, or it was very much frontier warfare. And just occasionally you get for a degree of circumstances that you get these big clashes of arms. And the book does try to investigate why then and there, and who were the personalities involved. But as I say, a lot of the time, the Ottomans certainly are always a bit like the Roman Empire before them, looking east and west. And the people they're distracted by in the east are other Muslims, fundamentally the Iranians. It was ethnically different.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show. Let's explore that, actually, before we get to... because on this podcast, I'm a great enthusiast of the Persian Empire.
Yep.
And we've discussed a few times about the Persians, the Iranians. Sebag has been on to discuss briefly. He talked about, the Shah in the latter part of the 20th century. But they're distinct. And you've already mentioned that the forces of Muhammad had destroyed the Persian Empire. But Iran and Persia is always sort of... It's a large landmass and a power, but it's kind of ebbs and flows as to its influence in the region.
Yes, well, the Iranians get very annoyed that the Americans can never seem to view anything about them other than through the prism of 1979, and they, of course, will go back to the Achaemenids, way before Alexander.
Alexander the Last Achaemenid king.
Yeah, well, he was quite right too. Before who was it? Not Ptolemy takes over.
Darius the second.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember who takes over from Alexander in that.
Oh,
region.
Right, yeah. Well, they all have a bit of a duff up.
Right. The Ptolemies, of course, the best known in Egypt. But the Achaemenid Empire was vast, and of course did encompass. This is the interesting thing in the region I've talked about, certainly to start with, in the Middle East, of course, the Turks feel they have some entitlement to it. The Persians do, the Arabs do, the Egyptians do. So you get the Achaemenids, and then, of course, after they go, you get the rise of the Sasanians, and it's the Sasanians who, for centuries, who've taken over from the Parthians, conduct this war, and that's the great geopolitical fact of life. It's the big war in Mesopotamia, with the border moving east and west, with the Sasanians against the Byzantians, the late Roman Empire. And of course, they're both weakened, and they both collapse under the hammer blow from the new Arab armies of Islam. But then, they reinvent. The Iranians are always deeply ambivalent about becoming Muslim under the Arabs, who they viewed as culturally very, very inferior, but they make what they can with it. And of course, in 1502, Shah Ismail, the first Safavid Shah of Shahs, converts formally, a bit like Constantine in Rome, converts Iran to Shiism.
From Zoroastrianism? From
mainstream Islam.
Oh, from Sunni?
Then, yes. So they are Muslim from the 8th century. Zoroastrianism is largely destroyed by the Arab armies of the Abbasids and the Umayyads. And so the Iranians exist with this long sense of their own cultural superiority. But Shah Ismail then decides that he's going to take them on the side of Ali, one of the descendants of the Prophet, and converts Iran and imposes Shiism on Iran. So you've got this ethnic group, the Iranians, very different from Arabs, very different from Turks. So you've got that ethnic tension is now overlaid with very much a religious one, a confessional one. And lo and behold, what happens, a bit like we're finding now, Iran then uses its influence through Shiism into the Arab and Turkish Sunni world. So Selim, of course, his first act is actually to massacre about 50,000 Shia who are technically in the Ottoman Empire. So he sets himself up now for about 200 years of the Ottomans and the Safavids fighting on the line of what actually is the modern day border between Turkey and Iran and Iraq and Iran. So for anybody sitting in Constantinople trying to work out, well, which way are we going to go this time? Are we going to knock out the Knights of Rhodes? Are we going to try and engage in the Mediterranean? It's not long after this that Barbarossa brings the Barbary Corsairs alongside, owes allegiance to the Ottoman Empire. Are we going to advance into Central Europe? Are we going to move on Belgrade? Are we going to go to Buda and Pest? Are we going to go for Vienna? Are we going to go into the Ukraine? So they're always, every year, they're confronted in the way that the Roman Empire was. And of course, after Mehmet II, they largely feel they've inherited the Weltanschauung, I suppose, the world view of the Roman Empire. So do we go east? Do we go west? Do we go into the Mediterranean? So they're normally rich enough to do both. Quite interesting, as the Romans were. But that long-term Iranian Shia opposition to Arab and Turk Sunnis is still very much a defining point of the modern world, which is why it's interesting you find Iranian Shia supporting Hamas, who are Arab Sunnis. Less surprising, they support Hezbollah, who of course are Shia.
Is that because, presumably, and we're going up to the modern era now, they're doing that simply because Hamas are just a tool with which to get at Israel, their sort of sworn enemy?
My enemy's enemy. I mean, Al-Qaeda were occasionally tolerated in Iran, even they were the most extremist of the Sunni fundamentalists, because it suited the Iranian government. It's why, Ismail Haniyeh was in Tehran, where he was killed. Is why Hezbollah opened another front, in support of the Palestinians, because at a certain stage, opposition to the West, opposition to the state of Israel, trumped confessional divide. But even in the 21st century, this is still really important in a way that if you're Catholic, as I am, that you really can't imagine a time when you were so opposed to Protestantism, you'd rather be fighting against fellow Christians than you would defending the frontiers. And of course, interestingly, Oliver, I'm always conscious that this sort of conversation grows arms and legs in a terrific way. Of course, for a long time, not only the Valois, of course, were so worried about the Habsburgs, who, of course, largely sort of encircle them either through the Holy Roman Empire or Spain and all the money coming in from the new territories. They actively have a treaty with the Ottomans for about 250 years. It's really until Napoleon invades Egypt, which is an Ottoman thing. So for 250 years, as far as the Valois are concerned, although their southern flanks are often, attacked by Barbary pirates, they feel a better community of realpolitik with the Ottomans than they do with others. And during the 16th century, you get the strange thing of the Catholic France and Protestant Northern Europe and the Ottomans talking to each other about ganging up on the Catholic Habsburgs. And the Ottoman fleet anchors in Toulon to winters there in 1543, and they turn the cathedral into a mosque. And the Ottomans and the French sailed together on 2 or 3 maritime expeditions over the years. So it's a very complex, when you raise it above, the headlines in the House of War are 10 great sieges and battles where the headline is Muslim soldiers against Christian soldiers. But even in that, at the siege of Constantinople, the Romanian division is absolutely chocker with Serbs and Vlachs and Avars and vassals and Christians fighting. At the siege of Nicopolis, it's the Serbian cavalry who fundamentally defeat the Burgundian-Hungarian Crusade of 1396.
Extraordinary. You've mentioned Vienna so far, and there are kind of, I guess there are watermarks throughout this long period of history. You've mentioned Charles Martel and Tours, and that's, what year is that? 750?
732.
732.
Exactly 100 years after Muhammad's death.
Right.
Prophet Muhammad's death.
That's actually probably the high watermark of the Caliphate in Europe, isn't it?
It is. That's exactly the thing, as Vienna will be in Eastern Europe.
Yes, so Vienna.
Yeah.
Now, this is this huge date.
And of course, Tours is the high watermark of Arab leadership of the Muslim world. That's the interesting thing. And of course, Spain is the only part of the Muslim world lost to the Christians. Hence why Spain, Andalusia, has a particular resonance again in Islamic mythology, because it's the only part taken by the Arabs. And of course, under the Turks, they took a lot more land, but it was lost. But the Turks are not necessarily seen as the legitimate heirs to Muhammad, because for 900 years, every caliph is from the Al-Qurayshi tribe. You have to be the caliph. So when the last shadow caliph dies in 1543, and Selim the Grim, he actually outlasts the collapse of the Mamluks. Selim the Grim takes the cloak and the sword of Muhammad from Cairo in 1517. When the last caliph dies, the Ottomans look around and say, well, I suppose that makes us the caliphs. And of course, they, by virtue of being the strongest Islamic power, disregard the Iranians, of course, who are heretics. The caliph is largely a Sunni. There are Shia caliphs, the Caliphates, the Fatimids, but it's largely a Sunni Arab that's now usurped by Sunni Turks. Anyway,
this is all great. And right, the Ottomans. Now we had recently we had a discussion with a historian on the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, I think this is rather the sort of well-known idea that the Ottoman Empire was in decline for hundreds of years. It sounds like almost as soon as it was established, it was in decline, although one could argue that's true of many empires. But 1683, which is when, for the benefit of listeners, why don't you explain it? You're a lot better about it than I am. But I'd be interested to know were they already in decline when they went for Vienna? But what is Vienna?
Yeah. No, they were not. 1689, they'd been in decline before. I mean, there was undoubtedly cycles. They'd had a series of very poor sultan caliphs after the death of Suleiman. And Suleiman's death comes at about the time when the Knights of St. John hold Malta, the great siege of Malta, 1565. A little while later, the great Battle of Lepanto, Don John of Austria is going to the war. I mean, an extraordinary reversal. And those basically ensure that the Ottomans never get into the Western Mediterranean. And then you have quite a long time in which there is a degree of Ottoman decline because of the character of individual sultans, and also because they're very distracted by wars in the East against the Iranians. And that sort of goes on. They're also very keen, of course, they take Cyprus, they take Crete. This is all late 16th century. And then Europe begins to devour itself in the 30 Years' War. So the Ottomans don't really take full advantage of that, but both sides begin to regroup, I suppose, in the mid-17th century. By this stage, the Valois are dead. The Bourbons have taken on this challenge to the Habsburgs. The Bourbons are still in a very strong treaty relationship with the Ottomans. So the marches of Europe, so, you've largely got the Holy Land is, very firmly under the Ottomans at this stage. They'll come apart in the First World War. Anatolia very firmly. The borders with Iran secured. The Mediterranean largely divided east-west. We're pre the rise of nationalism, really. I don't say pre it, but it grows up to about the Napoleonic time. So the next best thing is we keep going into the advancing up through the Central Europe. And through that time, they get to Belgrade, they go on to Buda, They move out against the Cossacks. They're fighting the Russians. The Russians are beginning to rise up a bit, or the time of Peter the Great, Catherine. So there's a lot of dispute about the Black Sea, Crimea. But in 1683, right at the end of a 20-year truce between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, the Ottomans had suffered a defeat at St. Gothard in 1664. Kara Mustafa, who's the great Grand Vizier at that stage, persuades Mehmet IV that let's go. This year's campaign, or next year's campaign, we're going back into Central Europe. And again, they're still, every year they know that there's a great council of war, and all Europe holds its breath. Which way are they going? Oh, phew. They're going against the Iranian Safavids again. Phew. That'll weaken them, take them out of the way. This year, without saying it, they suddenly realize, no, they're coming back into Central Europe. But really, very late in the day, Kara Mustafa and Mehmet IV decide they're going to go for Vienna. And a lot of people say, no. What we should be doing, we'll take the fortifications surrounding Vienna. The Habsburgs, they're being challenged by their own Hungarian neighbors, who are actually happier under the Ottomans than they are under the Austrians. A lot of Protestantism in there. We can continue to spin up the Protestants to an extent. We'll continue to let the French put pressure on the Habsburgs, and then we'll set ourselves up this year, 1683, and in 1684, that's the time we take Vienna, and then we'll break into Central Europe. We'll go beyond Central Europe. And Kara Mustafa and say, no, we're going to go for Vienna this year. And they're not wrong. As I say in the book, it's bold, it's daring, it's a bit late in the day. These are still armies that are driven by poor communications, and heavy siege trains and bad weather can bring them down. And they get to Vienna, and everything they think about the Viennese up to a point is true. They're quite divided. They haven't got many allies. They're not well liked. Their finances are in poor shape. The fortifications of Vienna aren't that good. But they do set about the siege in a very, very, not a desultory manner, but it's very unimaginative. It's a real slog on the southwestern corner of Vienna. Now, remember, Suleiman the Magnificent got as far as Vienna in 1529, and they fell back. And there's been a few moves towards it. So in they come, and they, for 2 or 3 months, they're battering away between the Löbel and Berg bastions. And meanwhile, Leopold, the Emperor Leopold, has left the city. And amazingly, the one thing he has done, because he's not a very imaginative commander, has done a deal with the Poles. While the Ottomans are advancing into Central Europe, the Poles are uncertain whether they're coming for Krakow and possibly Warsaw, amazingly, or Vienna. And so the Poles decide we'd better sign a treaty so that if they do come for Krakow, excuse me, the Habsburgs will support us and Vicky Verky. And there's a very, very good commander called Charles of Lorraine, who's basically a Frenchman, can't stand the French. They took his land, this is all into French stuff. And he is a terrific commander. And people come from Bavaria. There are Protestants there. The Saxony provides 10,000 troops as a relief force. The Hanoverians provide a company under the command of the future King George I of England.
Sorry, Simon, I'm interrupting you there. So the future George I participates?
Participates in the Siege of Vienna in 1683.
Wow. I didn't know that. I should have known that. Why are we not taught this?
And most significantly, of course, Sobieski, John III Sobieski, an elected king, fulfills his part of the bargain, and they come. And in many ways, the Battle of Vienna, right in the middle of September, and we talked about this a little bit earlier on about 9/11, is the inspiration for Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, the great battle around Minas Tirith. Minas Tirith is Vienna. Gondor is basically the Holy Roman Empire. The forces of Mordor, fairly or unfairly, are the Ottomans. And of course, Sobieski, with the winged cavalrymen of Poland, are the riders of Rohan. And amazingly, Kara Mustafa is so focused on Vienna that this relief army forms up on the western side of the Wienerwald, comes up over the Wienerwald. So it's up on the high ground, looking down, so it can see the Ottoman army, it can see Vienna. And then on the 12th, the morning of the 12th, they begin their advance. down the mountain. And again, they think will consolidate. Kara Mustafa, meanwhile, is moving troops out. He's still trying to take the walls of Vienna. It's touch and go, because at any stage they could have got over the walls of Vienna, and then they'd have found themselves besieging. But they're still in a great tented camp, but they're now trying to cover their western flank, which of course they should have done much earlier on. Charles of Lorraine advances with the infantry along the Danube, and extraordinarily, John III Sobieski brings 30,000 cavalrymen up the Vienna valve to then descend into the plain. It's really, really tough going. And they reach a certain stage at about midday on the 12th, and they've thought, right, we'll go so far, and then we'll consolidate, and the next day we'll complete it. And Charles of Lorraine says to his generals, and he did huge diplomacy. He's only a nobleman. He's got a couple of electors there. There's an emperor looking over his shoulder. I mean, several miles away, it has to be said. He's got another king as his ally. And he says, well, what do you think? And one of the generals there says, you know, I'm an old man. I'd rather fancy a bed in Vienna tonight rather than another night in a bed. And they say, right, we go on. And John Sobieski's made the same decision. And they plow on, and suddenly this great wave of Polish cavalry, which for some reason the Ottomans have not identified. You know, it's really ridiculous. They didn't have scouts out. They weren't holding the high ground. They hadn't fortified their western flank. It was obviously any relief force, but they're arrogant about it. Kara Mustafa, you know, who is, you know, got the power of life and death, so he's not listening to his commanders, obviously. And there's this great riders of Rohan charge, which basically sweeps them away. Kara Mustafa grabs the banner of the Prophet, which he's been given by Mehmet IV, and he grabs all his treasure. You know, the harem is left, the camels are left, this extraordinary sort of medieval / 1001 Nights huge tented camp is just deserted. And they do a fighting withdrawal basically back to Buda. The bells ring out and the whatever. And then the rather ungracious Emperor Leopold retakes his capital, shows almost no graciousness or thanks to Sobieski. But it's viewed as you said earlier on, Oliver, the high watermark of the Ottoman Empire. You know, from there it is a long decline, but gradually, you know, I suppose Western technology, Western organization, the fact that the Ottoman Empire is stretched in too many directions, it's got poor leadership, it's hampered by its incapacity to harness technology, it can't reform properly. You know, a bit like Saudi Arabia today, or until recently, the hold of the religious authorities is strong. And Kara Mustafa himself, he then loses two big forts which had been held by the Ottomans for decades. And at that stage, Mehmet IV sends two executioners up there, and they walk into the tent of the Grand Vizier. They say, could we have the banner of the Prophet, please? We'd like your chains of office. Kara Mustafa says, you know, can you remove the carpet? You know, I know exactly how this plays out.
So for God's sake, save the carpet.
That's right. Well, he's actually on the earth. So when I fall, and he literally lifts up his beard, puts his neck out. They put the bowstring round, and as I put in the I think in the book, Kara Mustafa died well, and he just quivers and he's lowered to the ground. They chop off his head. They strip the skin. They stuff it with straw, and an hour later they're back on their horses headed back to Edirne to present the stuffed head of the Grand Vizier to to Mehmet IV.
It's the most extraordinary story. It really is. I mean, the book is just quite wonderful. So listeners, you know, this is just so eye-opening for me. It's a period of history that really I don't think we're exposed to much. I wanted to end with a question, because you yourself, you fought in, I think, the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan as well?
Yeah, I was responsible for operations there. Yep.
Right. So now these are areas where, and this is a question I have, is these are areas that have seen that clash that, you know, similar to what we've been talking about in a modern setting. Is there too much consciousness? Because I think on the sort of, to call it Christendom, I suppose, or the West, we both would probably agree we don't know enough history. But in the East, is there too much consciousness of that history? Is there too much obsession over it, so that it does result in these horrific civil wars in the Balkans, and then, of course, get a resurgence of the Caliphate and that kind of thing?
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana lets you buy your next car on your terms. Explore a massive inventory online, filter for what matters, and find your perfect match. Then choose delivery to your home or pick it up at one of Carvana's iconic car vending machines. Every car also comes with a 7-day money-back guarantee, so you can make sure it's the right fit. Buy your car on Carvana. Delivery or pickup fees may apply. Limitations and exclusions may apply. See our 7-day return policy at Carvana.com.
Carvana.
Yes, I think it does. As we said in the book, Christendom, I would argue, largely dies on the battlefields of Europe in the First World War. The great Christian empires of Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany destroyed, France and Britain weakened, but Britain was an empire, but it was a Protestant empire, so it was Christian, but it didn't really pick up the baton. And of course, the Caliphate, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultanate is abolished by Kemal Ataturk, the great hero of Gallipoli, and then the Caliphate is abolished. But there is a thread that runs through Sunni Islam, particularly, which comes to the fore, which looks back to the glory days, back to we need a period of renewal. We've been in decline largely because we haven't been true to the word of the Prophet. We haven't lived the lives that the first caliphs led, the Rashideen, and therefore we're going to mine history. And as I say, these three great things of entitlement, inspiration, and grievance. And we're going to be very selective, but we'll be. Putin's doing the same in Russia, to be honest with you. And we all have mythologies. Ours, I would say, as Brits, it doesn't have much grievance in it. Got a degree of entitlement, but people try to chip away at that. And it's got a lot of inspiration. And again, people are trying to chip away at that. But we don't have much grievance. But in the Middle East, particularly when they remember the glory days of both Arab caliphates and the Ottoman caliphates, when they absolutely were the dominant power, and Europe really would look very backward in many departments. That wasn't centralized. It couldn't generate a decent administration. Its way of warfare was feudal. There was very little hygiene, administration, etc. So there's a temptation to look back and then look at the current state of the Middle East and feel a real sense of grievance. And I think the capacity, as I say, of applied history, and I'd put this book in that category. It's not designed to be, read this book for lessons today, so much as read it out of interest, because I think they're extraordinary stories. They're all epic. They're all historical. Some are decisive. Read it for education, because I think it'll fill in a lot of gaps, which people after they leave school and like don't have the time. But perhaps read it with an eye on the current Balkans or the current Levant, Mesopotamia, what's going on in Iran. And it will give you building blocks that you can, because I think historical building blocks are important, along with geographical building blocks. It'll give you some idea of these resonances that people still mine for modern day political advantage. And interestingly, the takfiri ideology, which they talk about, which is all about the almost ability to define somebody as a heretic, which of course, as we know, is applied to your own religion, is a sort of thread that's run through Islamic history since the Battle of Siffin, which again will be known by almost nobody, in 657, but again well known in the Muslim world, because it really forms the early split between the followers of Ali and those who went down the mainstream Sunni route, Muawiyah and Ali, with the Shiite al-Ali, followers of Ali. And in that, they tried to negotiate, and a bunch of hardliners just broke away and said, this is for God to decide, not man to arbitrate. And that, to an extent, still underpins the likes of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. There's this very fundamentalist, very, I'd say violent, quite extreme, very extremist, prepared to use violence against the infidel, that's obvious, but also the heretic, the compromiser, the apostate, somebody who's prepared to, deal with the other side. Hence why, for Al-Qaeda, yes, there's the Zionist state, the Zionist entity, as they call it. Yes, there's the Crusaders, us, but it's also the House of Saud, because they're viewed on as illegitimate, utterly unworthy guardians of the two holy cities, people who have compromised with the West, who don't live a holy life. So this moral purity, and we've seen Calvinists to an extent in in the Middle Ages had the same thing. It gives you great degree of certainty, gives you a moral, religious, ideological underpinning for carrying out real atrocities and being really hard line about taking out people you feel, erred from the true way. So as I say, the resonances of these splits and the Balkans, you're absolutely right. There's so much to do with those who compromised with the Ottomans. There's a dislike by the Turks because they feel they allowed freedom of worship, and under nationalism, these Christians who allowed to worship, betrayed them. It happened with the Armenians during the First World War. Of course, they not mad about the Arabs because the Arabs, of course, rose up against them disloyally, split the Caliphate during the First World War. So all of these one just needs to know enough about it when one studies modern politics to say, I can see a bit where that might come from. Or to ask the intelligent question, as I say. So I'd like to hear more. My understanding is, can't expect everybody to be an expert on some of the more esoteric aspects of history or religion.
Well, I think that's a perfect way. I think listeners, if they take anything away from this, they should take that away. And this has been fantastic, Simon. Thank you. And the book, The House of War, what's the publication date?
It came out funnily enough, it came out on the 13th of September.
Glorious stuff.
The day they retook Vienna.
Indeed. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Great. Well, Oliver, huge pleasure to talk to you. It's a subject about which I hope you can tell I'm quite enthusiastic.
Absolutely.
And I find it fascinating as well. And I hope your listeners and those who do buy the book or the Kindle or whatever, I hope the readers will also find it. Opens up saying, I'd like to read more. There's a good bibliography is there for excellent historians who've written about, in more detail about elements of this book.
Absolutely. Well, links are in the show notes. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more great history is on the way, including a very special guest. But until then, thank you and good night.